morning, Warsaw. Today is Friday, 1st September. It will be mostly cloudy all day with highs of 18 degrees Celsius or 64 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 6:02 a.m. and sunset at 7:41 p.m. We are on the 32nd day of the Warsaw Uprising, and George Orwell writes an interesting article. Stay tuned for that interesting piece.
Thanks for that, Philippe. I think Claire's going to kick us off today.
Well, so the day 32 is the 1st of September, which means that the polls have held out for a month now. And they've held the Old Town against a much better trained and equipped enemy during that time. But by the start of September, they start to feel there is no option but to order a retreat. But first, they are charging various battalions to try to create a corridor through which they can evacuate around 1,000 civilians and soldiers. That's the first plan. And among those charged with creating this corridor, this escape route out, is Rum, the member of the Chico Chemni, the Silent Unseen, the Polish Special Force paramilitary who has been sent in really just a few weeks before the Warsaw began. And so he first goes out and sort of scopes the territory. And we've got some wonderful descriptions of this. And funnily enough, first thing he did, as he's running between, I suppose, the stubble of the buildings that are left in the Old Town, he bumped into Jan Novak, who is the guy who is running the Lightning radio station. And they are amazed to see each other. They'd been flown in together only about 5 weeks earlier, but I think they're both astounded that each other is still alive. And so Jan Novak is very interested in Rum's assessment of the situation, but Rum refuses to give it until Jan promises to pass a message on the radio to Rum's wife in London. She was a WAF officer, so she was desperate for news. So they do this bit of a deal, and then Rum says that although he'd fought in France, he says that he has never been in such a desperate situation. So then he presses on with his work, which is to command his battalion, the Rum battalion, to set up this open corridor to get civilians and soldiers out of the Old Town. So they starts off with sabotaging some of the walls. This includes some women, some of these bombs women who are specialists in sabotage to try and create that escape route. And at first they have some success. They capture a machine gun and some Bren, some rifles and pistols, all of which, of course, are vital for the resistance forces. And they even capture 6 German prisoners of war, but Rum said the enemy did not budge. So after a while, the Germans realise what's going on and they seize the initiative on this area. And Rum said that just all hell broke loose and there were terrible losses. So at the end of that action, they've managed to get out a single unit of soldiers, but at the cost of 100 dead. And there's quite a poignant moment where Rum sees one of the soldiers in his battalion who is mortally wounded, and he borrows a Virtuti Militari, Poland's highest award for valour, from another soldier and presents it to the man on the ground before he dies, and then he called the retreat. So they are ultimately forced back, and it's quite clear that there is going to be no possibility of getting people out above the ground. So on the afternoon of the 1st of September, the commander of the Old Town, which is Colonel Wasznowski, sounds the alarm. The enemy has, by that point, the Germans have started attacking from all sides. He says there is constant air bombing, and he believes it's a general attack. He says to the rest of the Home Army commanders outside of the Old Town, he says, we probably won't be able to get to you with armed troops. So in response to that, General Monter, who's of course the head of the Warsaw Uprising from a military perspective, he orders the evacuation of troops now below the city. So they decide to travel through the sewers. I mean, absolutely appalling conditions. Monter says, I want as many people with weapons and ammunition to get through as possible. They will be needed to continue the fight. And so that evacuation in the sewers starts on the evening and it lasts right through until the next day. So Alina, do you want to tell us a bit about the sewer evacuations?
Yes, Claire. So exactly, it starts in the evening of today and it will last into the morning hours of the 2nd of September. So it was a decision from the Old Town to Śródmieście and Żoliborz. We've talked about some evacuations a couple of days prior that happened from the Old Town to Żoliborz. It was mainly soldiers, but there were some civilians involved in this as well. If you haven't listened to the episode where I talk about these sewers, I'm going to reiterate this a little bit just so you understand where we're coming from. So the distance between the Old Town and Midtown varied because there were 2 entryways. One is Plac Krasińskich and the other one is a little bit further down. One was about 1,600 metres and the other one was about 1,370 metres. So it took approximately 4 hours to complete this sort of journey. The one from Żoliborz to the Old Town, or Old Town to Żoliborz, was about 3,060 metres. So more or less about twice as long as the others. Anyway, so the sewers, what did they more or less look like? Well, there are 11 classes of sewers. You had A-class sewers, which were only 60 centimetres wide and 110 centimetres high. That's 3.5 foot high only. So you more or less had to crawl through these sewers. If you were a tall person, you would definitely be crawling on your hands and knees. Then you'd have classes 3, 4 and 5, and they would range between 140 centimetres high, that's 4.5 foot, or 157 centimetres high, that's 5.1 feet, or 175 centimetres, which is 5'7", or the largest, which was a class 11, which would be 240 centimetres, which is 7.9 feet high. So a lot of the time insurgents would have to bend over, they would have to crawl along, they were filled with waste, there was danger of Germans dropping petrol, setting it alight, throwing down grenades, it was dark, it was stuffy, it was smelly, and even Burkomorowski himself said that he knew many of a man who would quite easily run in front of a tank and throw a grenade or step in front of enemy fire, yet when they entered these sewers, they would go insane. It was the echo of the sound, a drop into the water, anything would echo throughout these whole sewers. So these insurgents would go through groups of 50 through the manholes, and approximately about 3,000 soldiers and another combat group of 1,500 soldiers make it through to the midtown, and another group of 800 make it to Żoliborz in the north. There is another passage where the Zośka battalion passed through, which is in the Saski Gardens, and they're the only ones who managed to escape the Old Town without using sewers. So there's about 50 of them all in all. So this evacuation ends about 9 a.m. in the morning, and the main hatch in Warecka Street is covered with rubble from a bombed building, and any insurgents or civilians who didn't reach the hatch in time were more or less having to find other escape routes out of the sewers. Lida Zental-Markiewicz has a very interesting testimony. She kind of describes more or less what it was like down in these sewers.
In the sewer, there was a rope allowing movement in the dock. It should have been attached to the wall, but it had broken off and was banging from wall to wall. I didn't want to enter the sewer. I was literally pushed into it by my friend Kajtek Staszek Romanowski. The Germans were already shooting at us with their weapons, so we had to walk from Hypoteczna Street for about 2 hours to this sewer. They told us to stand in between one gate then another until we finally arrived. The whole group was walking through the sewers, but at some point it turned out that we had lost our guide. Staszek Sieracki, nicknamed Świst, took it upon himself to lead us out. It was amazing, because he was lighting a candle. We were in darkness, some sewers were egg-shaped, a meter high. I was bending down slightly, but my taller colleagues had a big problem. Then we came across storm surges, and then the excrements reached up to the neck. The sewers were marked, that is, there were arrows with directions. It was usually the scouts from the field post who marked the crossings in the sewers. He said he would take us out. He leaned out. It turned out that the Germans, having no direct access to the sewers, fired at Staszek. He slumped, but they only shot through his camouflage jacket. Finally, after 4 or 5 hours, a very short time later, he led us out at the corner of Nowy Świat and Warecka streets. We were all shocked. They dragged us out. We were miserable, in a terrible condition. Without food, exhausted, grey. We looked horrible. And on the streets, people were elegantly dressed, clean houses intact, with electric lights.
This is the end for the Old Town. As of today, and the early hours of tomorrow, the Old Town has been defeated. There's about 35,000 people who have remained in the Old Town, including 2,500 seriously wounded insurgents, along with some doctors and nurses. And we will talk about what happens to these injured and the medical staff in the next coming days, because as you all very well can guess, there will be continuous murders of civilians and the injured, especially by De Levanga. We haven't spoken about De Levanga in a while, the sadist who runs his own battalion of absolute lunatics. But yes, we will come back to that. Apart from what's happening on the ground in the sewer evacuations, we also have things that are happening in the air. It's on this day that a Halifax Polish Air Force squadron is shot down and the whole entire crew is killed over the area of Hungary. They all currently rest in a cemetery near Budapest. There is a lot happening on the ground today. There is a lot happening in the air today. It's also quite important to be able to talk about some of these people who have lost their lives. Claire, who have you got for us? Who are we going to be talking about today?
Yes, it's always important to try and remember not just statistics, but individual people, I think. And my husband is a sculptor, and I've come across this story of Krystyna Drabowska, who was a sculptor. She was, before the war, she was a member of a quite well-known Polish artistic group, the Plastica. She created sculptures with religious themes, sporting themes, did a lot of architectural work, using bas relief. But as soon as the war started, she signs up and joins the resistance. And during the occupation, she worked also, she had a job. She was working in a sugar factory. Obviously, later, saving any sugar would be important during the uprising. But her main role during the uprising itself was she started serving as a nurse. And unfortunately, there are huge numbers of casualties on this day as the massive attack takes place in the Old Town area, and she is severely injured when she goes out to rescue another wounded civilian on the street. And unfortunately, she died of her wounds, actually in a German hospital. One of the tragic things about this, it's the loss of a life, of course, but it seems she's almost obliterated and forgotten, because not only did she die, but most of her artworks were lost in the Warsaw Uprising as well. So she's kind of left with very little memorial, all of her work and her endeavours. So I always think it's important to try and remember some of these stories. So that was the sculptor Krystyna Drabowska. We often think of the Spanish War as the artists' war, don't we? But of course, there were artists and writers and everyone in the Polish civilians involved as serving as volunteers, serving in the Home Army here, like Krystyna. So I found an artist, but Roger, you've been looking at writers, haven't you? And I know that George Orwell wrote about the Warsaw Uprising. What did he have to say?
Yes, 1st of September 1944, he wrote in Tribune, which is a left-wing newspaper then being published in the UK. And he'd been writing for Tribune. He'd been appointed as its literary editor after he left the BBC the year before. And it sort of became his occasional vehicle for sort of thoughts and ideas and contemplations on what was going on. And he wrote on the 1st of September to essentially criticise, as he often did, British or Western, but specifically British intellectuals, who he accused of just kind of slavishly following the Soviet line without actually any thought. And this is something I think, Orwell, who was, of course, politically of the left, but he was someone who absolutely saw with complete clarity, and this is what sets him apart. I think he's an absolutely astonishing figure. He saw with absolute clarity the hideous nature of Soviet rule, and how mendacity is absolutely central to what they do, and he sort of endeavoured to call it out wherever he could, and this was a good example. Now, he wrote this column. It was called As I Please. And in this particular one, he says at the beginning, now I know nothing of Polish affairs. But he goes on to say that, neither do most, Western and British intellectuals. And yet, he says, the attitude of most of the British intelligentsia is that they slavishly follow what they believe to be Russian policy, no matter what turn it takes. And he carries on to say, if tomorrow Stalin were to drop the Committee of Liberation, the Lublin Committee, and recognise the London government, i.e. the Polish exile government in London, the whole British intelligentsia, he says, would flock after them like a troop of parrots. Their attitude towards Russian foreign policy is not, is this policy right or wrong, but this is Russian policy, how can we make it appear right? And in that, I think he absolutely hits the nail on the head in terms of the attitude of the bien-pensant centre-left classes in London and elsewhere. And this is it gives you a taste of the atmosphere in which these struggles between Polish government in exile and the Soviets were taking place. And very often, the Polish government in exile really didn't have much support from contemporary Western opinion, even though they would have expected to have it in a sort of battle against a totalitarian regime. But Orwell puts his finger very much on the reason why they didn't have that support. So it's a really interesting article.
Love the article by George Orwell. Remember, send us your questions if you have any, and also don't forget to give us a 5-star review on your favourite listening platform, and we will see you tomorrow for day 33, which will be the 2nd of September.